Imagine a world so corrupt that God Himself regretted creating humanity. Today, we're diving deep into Genesis chapter 6, a pivotal moment when the divine hit the reset button on creation. We'll unpack 14 theological points that reveal why this ancient story matters more than ever.
And what's fascinating is how this chapter sets up one of the most dramatic interventions in human history. It's not just about judgment, it's about redemption, covenant, and a complete reboot of humanity.
Let's start with something that's puzzled readers for centuries. Who exactly were these sons of God who married the daughters of men?
Well, there are two major views here, the Sethite view and the angelic view. The Sethite interpretation, which aligns best with the narrative flow of Genesis 4:6, suggests these were descendants of Seth, the godly line.
So you're saying this wasn't about supernatural beings?
Exactly. If you look at Genesis 4 and 5, you see this deliberate contrast between two spiritual lineages, Cain's violent, proud line versus Seth's godly line that called on the name of the Lord.
And what happens when these lines intersect?
That's when things fall apart. The godly line gets corrupted through intermarriage, choosing partners based on physical beauty rather than spiritual values.
Sounds familiar. Choosing the external over the internal.
Right, and this leads to these giants, not necessarily physical giants, but people of great pride who ruled through violence and fear.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean by giants of pride?
They were like Lucifer in heaven, trying to elevate themselves above others. Every intention of their hearts was pride-based, not humility-based.
And this is what grieved God's heart?
Exactly. The text says every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It was a complete rejection of God's way.
But then we meet Noah. What made him different?
Noah found grace, but it's deeper than that. He was graceful to others at his own cost. For 120 years, he preached about the coming flood while building the ark.
Wait, 120 years? That's a long time to be ridiculed while building a massive boat.
And here's something fascinating about that boat. The Hebrew word for pitch used to cover the ark shares the same root as the word for atonement.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that connection.
It's this beautiful pattern. Just as pitch covered and protected the ark from judgment, blood would later cover sin and protect from judgment. It's the first appearance of the covering theme that becomes central to the gospel.
That's incredible. And speaking of the ark's design, I heard there are some interesting parallels with the temple.
Yes, both had 3 levels, 1 door, light from above, and were built according to divine blueprints. The ark was essentially the first house of God, a floating sanctuary.
Let's talk about the animals. Why 7 pairs of clean animals, but only 1 pair of unclean?
The clean animals were needed both for food and sacrifice. Plus, they were vegetarian, so there wouldn't be bloodshed on the ark.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want predators hunting in a confined space.
And here's something interesting. God honored Adam's naming of the animals by preserving all species, clean and unclean.
You mentioned earlier about the 120-year lifespan. Wasn't that a punishment?
Actually, it was more like mercy. Think about it. The longer people lived in their corrupt state, the more sin and suffering accumulated.
That reminds me of that Japanese art form you mentioned earlier, kintsugi.
Yes, just as they repair broken pottery with gold, making it more beautiful than before, God takes our brokenness and transforms it into something glorious.
What strikes me is how relevant this story feels today. We're still dealing with issues of pride, corruption, and choosing physical beauty over spiritual values.
Absolutely. And just as Noah was a preacher of righteousness in his time, we're called to stand for truth in ours.
Can you elaborate on Noah as a type of Christ?
Noah offered himself as a sacrifice for people who hated him. He believed in a better world and was willing to stake everything on that belief.
Just like Christ?
Exactly. And like Christ, Noah became a kinsman redeemer, making a covenant with God on behalf of all humanity.
Let's talk about this covenant. What made it so significant?
It was the first major covenant between God and humanity after the fall. Through Noah, God was essentially rebooting creation, giving humanity a fresh start.
And yet, even with this fresh start, humanity still struggled with the same issues.
True, but that's why the story points forward to a greater solution, not just covering sin, but transforming human nature itself.
Which brings us back to Christ.
Exactly. The flood story isn't just about judgment, it's about hope, redemption, and God's commitment to humanity despite our failures.
What lessons can we take from this today?
First, that pride, elevating ourselves above others and God, leads to destruction. Second, that God always preserves a remnant of faithful people.
And third,
that God's judgment always comes with provision for salvation. There's always an ark, always a way out for those who trust him.
Speaking of trust, imagine being Noah's family, stepping into that ark.
With no rain in sight, no precedent for a global flood, just pure faith in God's word.
That's real faith, not just believing, but acting on that belief.
And remember, they weren't just saving themselves, they were preserving life for future generations.
Let's talk about the violence that filled the earth. How bad was it really?
The text says the earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew implies both physical violence and moral corruption had reached a saturation point.
And God's response was both judgment and mercy?
Yes, judgment on sin, but mercy in providing a way of escape. Just like the ark had one door, salvation has one way, through Christ.
These parallels between the ark and Christ are fascinating.
And they're intentional. The Bible is telling one story, God's rescue mission for humanity.
What about the size of the ark? Was it really big enough?
The dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, would have provided ample space for all the animals and supplies.
And it all comes back to this theme of God's provision.
Exactly. God doesn't just warn of judgment, he provides everything needed for salvation.
As we wrap up, what's the key takeaway from Genesis 6?
That in every age, God calls people to trust him enough to look foolish to the world, like Noah building an ark on dry land.
And sometimes that trust means standing alone.
But never truly alone, because God is always faithful to his covenant.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Copilot Podcasts. Remember, whether you're facing your own flood or building your own ark, God's provision always matches his calling.
And just like Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, that same grace is available today. We just have to be willing to step into the ark.